Great. Okay, thank you all for coming to the second of our Colloquium series talks. We have today Dr. Preston Green, who I'm going to list a variety of things that he's done because he's actually extraordinarily well accomplished. But of course, I'm happiest about his being a fellow graduate of Columbia Law School. But apart from that, which is of course what everybody should be noting, is he's a professor of educational leadership and law at the University of Connecticut. He's created a variety of dual degree programs in previous institutions, but in practice, he helped develop the UCAP law program, which helps participants obtain a law degree and school administrator certificate at the same time, which I think is pretty awesome. He also developed the School Law Online Graduate Certificate, a 12-credit online program that helps educators, administrators, and policymakers understand legal dimensions of K-12 education. So Dr. Green's work focuses on school choice. He has a number of articles. I believe it says 5 books. Are we still at 5 books?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So we have at least 5 books and a number of articles in empirical journals as well as law journals on school choice and equity questions. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I hope that we all welcome Dr. Green with a very strong applause.
Well, I thank you. I thank Dr. Shaw and Dr. Galan so much for inviting me to be a part of this colloquium. I mean, this is, I've heard a lot about Vanderbilt over the years. This is one of the institutions to be in for education. So for all you graduate students out there, I hope you take advantage of that opportunity. This is wonderful. Now, I will. The title of my topic is a non-controversial title called Charter Schools, Academy Schools, Related Party Transactions, Same Scams, Different Countries. So let me tell you how I kind of arrived at this project. This is a follow-up to an article that will be published in Indiana University Law Review titled, Are Charter Schools a Second Coming of Enron? And in this article, my colleagues and I talked about how charter schools were taking advantage of related party transactions. These are transactions between companies with co-bonds in a manner similar to the Enron debacle of the early 2000s. And in this article, we explained how charter schools were engaging in this type of this problematic transactions, and also critiqued the monitoring systems that were in place to protect against related party transactional abuse. Now, during the sort of publicity for this article, I got into conversations with a journalist in England named Warwick Mansell, who has also been analyzing issues with academy schools, England's academy schools, which are very similar to charter schools. And he also noted that there were problems with related party transactions. And so I promised him that, you just gave me another project. Why are these issues playing out the same way in charter schools and academy schools? So it will be an article with a graduate student, Chelsea Connery, which will be published in University of Arkansas Law Review. And this is the sort of first public go-around for this. So as I told you, grill me, because I really need to practice, and it will help me think about how to improve the paper. Now, before going into the problems of related party transactions, it's important to understand the similarities between charter schools and academy schools. So both of these schools are publicly funded, but they are independent from the local educational agencies that that run traditional schools. In the case of public schools, these are school districts, and in the case of charter schools, these are school districts. In the case of academy schools, these are local educational authorities. Now, in both charter schools and academy schools, there is an agreement, or like a charter or an academy deal, between the school and some entity that is placed in charge of looking after those schools. In the case of charter schools, these are charter authorizers, and in the case of academy schools, this is the Department for Education, which is the department under Her Majesty's government that is responsible for education in England. Both charter schools and academy schools have freedom from many rules and regulations that apply to traditional schools, traditionally funded schools, including those pertaining to budgeting. And another similarity between charter schools and academy schools is that each of them are operated, many of them are operated by entities that provide management services. In the case of charter schools, these are education management organizations, or EMOs. 42% of charter schools are operated by EMOs. And in the case of academy schools, they're operated by a management organization known as a multi-academy trust. Now let's talk about the similarities and differences between EMOs and multi-academy trusts. Now in the case of EMOs, they can be both public, they can be both for-profit or nonprofit. Now, and by contrast, MATs are all nonprofit. EMOs, I should also point out, are governed by corporate law. It deals with private corporations. In the case of multi-academy trusts, or MATs, they are governed under not only they're governed under charity law, also under corporate law, but they also have to comply with educational legislation. So there's a more of a connection with the government for MATs than with EMOs. Now, EMOs contract with charter school boards. Charter school boards have the responsibility of providing operating charter schools, and many of them will contract with EMOs for management or other like vending services. Now, MATs are slightly different in that they're actually will manage a group of academy schools, and they will do that on the behalf of the Education, Skills, and Finance Funding Agency. And the ESFA is, actually I forgot to point that out, the ESFA is an executive agency that is responsible for providing oversight, and they do this and they work under the aegis of the Department for Education. Now, in both charter schools and in MATs, EMOs and MATs, there have been a number of arguments in support for EMOs and MATs. Now, the Center for Educational Reform has issued a number of publications arguing for EMOs, and they make really four important points about them. One is that EMOs can cause replication, and that is that there is a chance that there can be increase the number of successful charter schools throughout the nation. The problem with independent charter schools is that they cannot really kind of ramp up to scale. And so EMOs provide that opportunity. Secondly, there's a benefit of economies of scale. Charter schools that are under an EMO can actually save money because the EMO will then provide resources for all those schools. And so it costs less money to run these schools than it may be for an independent charter school. There's also the benefit of collaboration. Schools that are under the aegis of an EMO can actually talk with one another, learn from each other, and develop ideas that they may not be able to do on their own. And finally, there's support structures. EMOs can provide resources for charter schools that may not be available if these schools are standing by themselves. So there's an argument for for resources for these schools. Now, in the case of MATs, all of these arguments have been made, but in addition, there's the argument for curricular and extracurricular activities. And I should point out, in 2016, there was a government white paper that talked about the possibility of converting all schools, traditional schools, into academy schools by 2022. There was a major uproar that did not happen. But the governmental goal right now is to convert as many schools to academy schools as possible. But the other benefit that was mentioned in this white paper article was the benefits for curricular and extracurricular services. An MAT might be able to provide more opportunities for learning that may be available in locally maintained schools. Now, as I mentioned, this paper is about related party transactions in EMOs and MATs and the abuses of this. So the question is, what are related party transactions? The definition is as follows. There's a business arrangements where one party has control over another or when they are both under common control. Now, an example of this in a charter school in the MAT sector may be a situation where you have an EMO that operates charter schools, but it also has a vending, let's say a technology company, a related for-profit technology company that EMO, CMO also operates. This could also be the case for governing board members, people who are responsible for running charter EMOs. They may also have for-profit related businesses that provide services. And we also see instances where family members, where EMOs work with companies that are run by family members, be it a parent, a spouse, or children. Now, there have been a number of arguments for these related party transactions for charter schools and EMOs. And there are two that I want to mention in this talk. One, of course, is economies of scale. If you have EMOs with related property or related companies working with them, you may be able to save, money in ways that would not exist if these EMOs were running by themselves. And then there's the benefit of in-house expertise. That is, if you have trustees or other managers who have expertise and who are running companies who can provide services for these schools, then the schools that are under the aegis of the EMO or the MAT can benefit from that wisdom. So these are the arguments that have been presented in support of related party transactions in these sectors. But there is a concern about this, and that concern is that related party transactions have inherent conflict of interest. While they may have benefits, there is the possibility that persons who have this common ownership may take actions that benefit their bottom line with respect to these other companies as opposed to the schools themselves. And so in these systems, there have to be monitoring systems to guard against this conflict of interest. Now, what is the scope of related party transactions in academy schools and also in charter schools, and how involved are these management companies in these related party transactions? Up front, there's really not a lot of information. No one's really done a compilation about this in the United States. In part, when we scoured the research, we've not been able to find that. But there have been some studies. There's one study done by the Grand Rapids Institute that's looked at Arizona. And what they found was that 77% of charter schools in Arizona during 2014 had related party transactions. And 48% of charter school expenditures in the entire state were owed to related parties. So at least in Arizona, we have evidence that related party transactions are really prevalent in the charter school world. Now, I have not found any sort of research that have talked about sort of like how many of them are run by MATs or EMOs. Maybe some of you, throwing this out there, who are looking to do follow-up research, you can do this, and I'll be willing to write with you about that. But I think that if you look at what's happening in the academy school sector, I think it's safe to say, I'm comfortable to say that there's probably a lot of activity with related party transactions with EMOs. And so there actually is a requirement to kind of collect this information. And what was found in 2013 in an analysis done by the Education, Skills and Funding Agency was that 43% of academy trusts, that includes trusts that only operate one academy school, but also many that operate more than one or multi-academy trusts. They have like more than 1,000 transactions totaling 71 million pounds. By 2016, this number has gone up, even though the transactions have gone down. They've gone up to about 3,000 transactions for a total of almost 121 million pounds. And many of these transactions are, I think they're like 50 or maybe 100 of these transactions, I don't recall, but there are quite a few transactions that total more than 500,000 pounds. So it's important to understand that many of these transactions are for a great deal of money. Now, yes?
Can I just ask a clarification? I'm trying to get this related party transaction. Could you give me an example? Is it like someone on the board of this EMO also is on the board of some for-profit company?
You got
and
it.
They do business.
And they do business
Okay.
together. And that person is in charge of both. That person's either in charge of both or is a manager of both.
Okay.
So like a trustee or a board of governors. So they've got, they have high level control of both. That's the example. Mm-hmm. Now, there are examples of sort of like, yes?
Is there a related number for the percentage of public school expenditures that would go towards leases? The 48% number for charter schools, is there a comparable number for public schools?
I've not seen a comparable number for public schools. I mean, I will say though that there are definitely examples of these problematic transactions in the public school sector. One is in California, actually. So I mean, so it's important to understand that you do see these issues play out in traditional school settings. Yeah. Well, I want to give an example of like questionable related party transactions that have raised concerns, for governmental watchdogs. I want to give an example for charter schools, an example for academy schools. Now, understand that in the case of charter schools, we've had a number of people, including yours truly, who've written about kind of like abuse of related party transactions with relation to real estate. And a prime example of this is Imagine Schools. Imagine Schools is a nonprofit nonprofit EMO that runs more than 60 schools across the nation. Now, notice that while this EMO is nonprofit, it also has a for-profit real estate arm known as Schoolhouse Finance, which handles all facility real estate deals. And what has been found in these real estate deals is that many of the charter schools that are operated by Imagine Schools pay up to 40% of their funding in rent. And this is more than 3 times that of which typical charter schools spend. So, this is an example of sort of an abuse, or typical abuse that we see in traditional public schools, in charter schools. An example, in the MAT sector, an example that I want to bring up is Bright Tribe Academy Trust, which runs 10 companies, sorry about that, 10 academy schools, yes.
I just have a clarifying question. So when they're spending that money, are you saying that like this for-profit arm owns that property, and so they're leasing from the same company that is jointly?
You want me to get into triple net leases? Okay, this is like, what happens is that the company, it's a really kind of complicated transaction called a triple net lease. And that is where the charter school, will rent the EMO will, identify property, then the real estate agency then buys that property. And then what happens is that then that real estate agency then rents that property out to the charter school. And so what happens is that the rent paid by the EMO to the real estate arm is much less than the rent that is paid, much less than the rent that the charter school pays to that real estate arm. And the design of this is to create like a long standing funding stream. And so what ends up happening with this funding stream is that there are instances where a charter school, and these could last for 25 to 30 years. And so by the time this is over with, the charter school may have been spending much more money than if it just bought the property right out. Now, to be fair, the reason why these entities have come into the argument for this is that charter schools have a hard time buying real estate because they cannot, enter into bonding arrangements in the same way that traditional public schools do. So this is an example that gives them that opportunity, but there are instances where this gets abused. So this is an example of that. So I just want to mention that in the case of Bright Tribe, Bright Tribe is an example of related party transactions between the Academy Trust and then companies that were owned by the CEO. And in this case, over 2 years, I had 600,000 pounds in 2017. So over the course of 2 years, there were 4 million pounds of related party transactions between the Academy Trust and companies that were owned by that, by that director. And then there was a governmental investigation which found that 80% of the governors of that Academy Trust had related party transactions. So again, this is an example of an egregious abuse, and this then led both in the U.S. sector and also in the academy sector to calls for actually to create monitoring systems that would address this problem. Now let's talk about some state responses. Thus far, there have really been only two that two that have really kind of addressed the issue of related party transactions head on. One is Connecticut, where I presently reside, and Connecticut actually requires that the charter authorizer, which is the State Department of Education, to document and then approve all related party transactions. And in its analysis, it will look to see whether these transactions are at cost. And when I say at cost, I mean to make sure that there's actually no financial gain or profits. Also appropriate and necessary. Is this something that is actually needed? And then finally, that the deal does not exceed fair market value. So Connecticut has a rule directly dealing with related party transactions. California, you might have heard in the news that California just recently passed a bill that dealt with related party transactions specifically for for-profit companies. But while it says that for-profit companies cannot operate charter schools, this bill, which was just recently passed, also prohibits the creation of nonprofit shell companies. So that kind of shell game that I just talked about, where you have a nonprofit giving money to a for-profit, is actually prohibited with respect to day-to-day operations. So it's so anything that relates to day-to-day operations, there cannot be this sort of shell company arrangement. However, the statute seems to allow such arrangements as long as they are approved by the charter, charter school board. So those are the two states that have directly addressed this issue of related party transactions. Now in England, there have been a number of steps that have been taken to try to address the issues of related party transaction. The first one deals with what we call England's at-cost policy. And what this means, again, is that academy schools, that Academy Trust cannot enter into related party transactions that will create some form of profit. Originally, it was like absolutely no profit, but subsequently the rules were adjusted to allow a profit of up to 2,500 pounds. And then this job was left up to auditors to determine how this actually occurred in each of these transactions. I will get to that later. And then very recently, the Department for Education just amended its rules to require that all academy transactions, all related party transactions exceeding 20,000 pounds have to be approved in advance by the Department for Education. And so what that means is that, and this is actually just for any transaction, any one transaction above 20,000 pounds or a cumulative amount. So once it reaches like more than 20,000 pounds, then, then there is this supposedly greater scrutiny of related party transactions in these MATs.
Does that include the hiring of teachers?
If it's connected to an academy trust, yes. If it's connected to a related party transaction, yes. Yeah. So so if it's if it's an EMO, if it's an MAT and there's and then they're dealing with a company owned by a trustee that's hiring teachers, that could be part of it. Yes.
So I haven't thought about this related party transaction issue before, so this is very educational. What I don't understand is this a problem specific to education, or what about education makes this a worse problem than what we would see in healthcare, with the government providing some other funding in some other sector?
Okay, I'll answer that question right now. I think that this is a problem that occurs in every sector. This is a problem that occurs in every sector where you have a private entity providing a public good or a public service. This happens all the time. The struggle that kind of what leads me to studying these issues is that in education there's many times the failure to appreciate that problem and then to design monitoring accordingly to prevent abuse. And so what leads me to a lot of my research is to think about how are these problems occurring in other privatization interests, and how does that relate to education, and what can we learn?
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm a little still stuck on this 40% for Imagine schools. So I can see why that would potentially be a problem. I can see what might happen in terms of they're not spending that money on kids.
Mm-hmm.
What do you? I don't maybe imagine you asked for their comment, or what would whoever is running Imagine, what would they say is the reason why they're spending so much more on rent? Do they have at least a stated reason why this would be a legitimate transaction?
I think that the argument is that real estate does cost quite a bit. It really does cost quite a bit to get facilities up and running and to devote the money into those resources. So so the companies would argue that that they're taking a short-term risk to develop the resources, and so they need that money up front in order to build those buildings. That's the argument that they would make. Imagine Schools has a problem making that argument. I didn't talk about this, but there actually was a case in 2015 dealing with an Imagine Schools, Imagine Schools school out in Missouri, where a federal court found that the EMO failed to satisfy its fiduciary duty to the charter school board to let them know the types of problems that they're going to be facing with their rent, and then fine EMO $1 million. So Imagine Schools may have a problem making this argument, but I would say that the argument is that it does take a lot of money to build facilities, and so they need that money up front, and they want to cover their risk because there's no guarantee that the school is going to be in place after 5 or 7 years. So that's kind of what their argument is. Any other questions? Yes.
So I guess related to that, I'm wondering if in Arizona or in different contexts, if you have seen places or people making the argument that charter schools don't necessarily have the same access to funding for buildings or the property that they're usually funded on. There are a few examples of various entities creating funds for charter schools to get loans for buildings.
Right. Yeah, California, for instance, provides a facilities grant, facilities grant, where it recognizes that charter schools don't have the resources for facilities, and then they provide those resources to schools that are located in communities that were 50% of people are free or reduced lunch. So it's actually targeted for communities, targeted in communities where they believe that those services are needed. So yeah, there are instances where some states, like California, have provided those sources.
So would that help explain at least part of the gap between the 15% that a traditional public school would spend on facilities rather than the 40%?
That would be the argument that could be made. Yeah, I think that, if there were, that would be the argument that they could push back on and say that this is necessary to cover startup costs. So that would be, but I think that empirically then, what then has to happen is to see what happens in future years. I will tell you that I'm always contacted by reporters who find egregious actions, and then they tell me about it, and I'm just surprised. But there have been a number of instances, especially say in Pennsylvania, where you see kind of rents kind of rise after a certain time, where they can rise maybe up to 2 or 3 times the amount of what is originally being paid for. And in fact, that's actually happened in California in one of the cases that I chronicle in the Enron paper. So, so you do have these sort of anecdotal instances where you have rents rise up way beyond the time when one could make the argument that it's needed to do. Any other questions? Well, I wanted to, what I've been pondering with my colleague Bruce Baker at Rutgers, Joseph Olawale at Montclair State, and now my graduate student Chelsea Connery at UConn, is kind of like, how do these problems occur? Like, what is sort of like driving these issues? And then how can we mitigate these problems? And so in the Enron paper, in some of the other work that I've written about on this issue, I think that we've arrived at the conclusion that many of these problems are brought about by a special case of the principal agent problem. And what that is, and the principal agent problem is a concept in political science and economics and so on that says that it occurs that when a principal contracts with an agent on the principal's behalf. So when someone asks someone else to do something for it. And the principal agent problem occurs when the principal just doesn't have enough information to kind of know what the agent is actually doing. And so, so it doesn't have enough information to judge what the agent is doing. And there may be instances where that agent has different incentives. So in the case of funding, in the case of school funding issues, what happens is that you have a principal, and I'll go into this in the next slide, a principal that wants fiscally responsible funding, fiscally responsible spending, but then you have agents who may actually want something else. They want to improve their bottom line. And so what happens then is that we have to come up with monitoring systems or some incentive, and one of those incentives is monitoring systems to guard against abuses or egregious abuses of that problem. Now, I think it's important to understand that this is not a problem that is, that exists just in the academy school and charter school sectors. There are principal agent issues in traditional public schools. You have local communities and school boards, you have school boards and central administrative staff, and you could have principals who are, I'm sorry, it's a school, like the school who's the principal and the principal who's the agent. You can see why I got confused there with principals there. But I think that in each of these instances, you have a principal-agent relationship where it is possible that that agent may have an interest not so much in ensuring fiscal responsibility, but improving their own financial benefits. And so that definitely happens in traditional schools. So I want to make that clear. And so there is monitoring set up to guard against this. There's auditing, there's registration of possible conflicts, and there's also competitive bidding or contracting. So, there's a requirement that that these vending contracts or various contracts be put out to bid, and in instances where there is a possible conflict of interest, the other governors or the other people who are making decisions about this, they make the decisions, and the person who stands to benefit recuses him or herself. So there are all these mechanisms in place to try to guard against this principal-agent problem, and we still have issues. So I just want to make that clear. But I want to note that there is a principal-agent problem in EMOs and in multi-academy trusts that go beyond that of traditional school systems. And that is that there's also the wish to, you do have this conflict where the principal wants fiscally responsible activity and the agent wants to make money, but what you have here is a system that creates related party transactions. So in the case of EMOs and MATs, related party transactions are an actual feature here. As recalled from an earlier slide, I pointed out that, that various folks have argued for related party transactions. And so this is something that is actually encouraged in ways that they're not encouraged in traditional sectors. So because of that encouragement, it stands to reason that there may be more chances for abuse. And so what we have been saying in our research is that we have to think about that possibility and then design strategies to guard against this. Also keep in mind that there's a lot of money that can be made. I will point, there's an Arizona nonprofit called Primavera Academy, I believe that's the name. It is the largest online EMO, it is the largest online charter school in Arizona. It is run by a nonprofit EMO. That nonprofit EMO also has a vending contract with a for-profit entity that's a related party for about, I believe, I want to say about $12 to $15 million for the provision of technology. And in contrast, it was pointed out that a school district, a local Arizona school district, in comparison, says that for its technology requirements, it would cost about $760,000. So we're talking about a factor of possibly 15 in this case. So you have instances where there can be a great deal of money made for large-scale vending contracts. So that's why one has to really pay attention to the possibility of violation. So let's talk about how am I doing for time before I... Okay, just want to make sure that, because I'm getting into it, I don't want to just start going. Understand that there are monitoring systems set up for EMOs and for MATs. Now, I should point out that in the United States, this is a state-driven system, whereas an MA for a multi-academy trust, this is federal. This is national. Now, you may ask, where is the federal government in the case of EMOs? Because we have a federal system. We have states and we also have the federal government. I only include the federal government in the monitoring system because the federal government has not really taken monitoring of funding, spending accountability in the same way as it has been more concerned about increasing the number of charter schools. This really has not been a focus on that. So because of that, I don't really include the federal government as part of this monitoring system. But with that said, there are similarities between the two, and I'll go through them very briefly. You notice that there are auditors on both sides. And auditors actually these are independent auditors who are there to to analyze the spending done at the end of the year. And they're supposed to make sure that the numbers add up and to catch possible fraudulent activity. So the auditors are there to monitor the end of the year numbers. Then you have charter school boards and academy school boards. These are the entities that actually provide oversight over the schools themselves. In the case of charter school boards, this is an individual relationship. Each charter school is responsible for monitoring the activities of the EMOs. In the case of academy school boards, you have a board of governors who are responsible for making sure that the money that is spent in all those schools, the academy chains, are done in a fiscally responsible manner. And the third sort of check are charter authorizers, and in the case of the US, and the Education Skills and Funding Agency in the case of England. And in both of these instances, these are the schools, these are the entities that are supposed to look at the contracts, let's say, and provide general oversight to make sure that there is no abuse. And then finally, you have entities that actually perform investigations in case of hearing that there's a possible fraudulent activity. In the case of EMOs, this could be the charter authorizer, or it could be other state level entities such as the State Department of Education or a state auditor. In the case of England, it's the Department for Education, which is which runs educational issues in England. So very quickly, I'm just going to note that in this paper, we talk about the problems that we see in the various, among these various sort of monitoring entities, and then the steps that can be taken. I'm just going to, in the case of auditors, we see in both instances that auditors have really failed to take into account the dangers of related party transactions. They're actually required to do so by auditing guidelines, either national, various auditing guidelines, but in many instances they fail to do so. So one major change that could occur here is that they need to identify possible risks in these sectors and then focus on those entities, focus on those types of relationships. So what I'm saying is that they should analyze the risk and then ahead of time focus on those issues. Now, I should also say that I'm not a big fan of the at-cost policy, which is the idea of looking at every transaction to make sure that there is, no profit. I think that's getting way into the weeds. And I don't think that there's enough resources really to do that. I think they would be better spent really kind of identifying areas where there could be damage and then correcting them. In the case of academy boards, I should say in both of these instances we see two problems. One is that many of these boards are hired by the manager of the EMO or the manager of the MAT, and they also lack sophistication for oversight. Many of these people are, they want to do the right thing, they are, community oriented, but they just don't have the skill set really to deal with some of these sophisticated transactions. So I think steps that need to be made in both of these instances are actually enforcing requirements that, that they be actually independent, that these governors be independent from, from the managers of the EMOs. And then finally, that they provide corporate governance or corporate guidance here with a focus on related party transactions. With respect to authorizers and the Education Schools Funding Agency, I would argue that the biggest step that needs to be taken really is to give them the power to look over contracts that may be especially problematic. So all related party contracts that they identify as problematic should be subject to review up front. In the United States, I would argue that real estate transactions are certainly an area that needs to be focused on, and similar analysis needs to be made in England. And I would argue that, I have issues with California's approach. California, as I said, focuses on day-to-day transactions, but I would argue that that's not enough. You also need to deal with vending agreements as well. So I would say, focus on those areas that may be problematic, and then subject those to review. And then finally, a big problem that has occurred in cases where one hears about possible fraudulent action is that the big concern is that we get investigations only when we hear about whistleblowers. And so one, I think, possible fix is, again, for authorizers, for these investigators, not to wait for whistleblowers, but again, to identify transactions that may be problematic and give those transactions special focus. So take more of a proactive stance as opposed to waiting for hearing about possible problems when they occur. So in conclusion, I think that this is kind of like what I think right now. as to the steps that need to be taken. And I just want to stay up front that I don't take the position that related party transactions should be banned. I do think that there are possible benefits and that we should encourage those benefits, but we have to understand that there is the potential for abuse. And so, we have to understand that there are temptations there. There are temptations there for those EMO managers, for those MAT managers, that may make some of them willing to take chances. And that if there is no sense that there could be possible repercussions for those chances, they're more willing to take them. So to guard against this, legislators need to improve their monitoring to guard against these transactions. And I think by doing that, they take a greater chance of making sure that these school systems, that these educational reform approaches will better serve the needs of their children. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask the first question. We're not surprised. All right. So I was thinking the entire time you were talking about corporations law, and antitrust law in particular, and how there seems to be some gap between the two. And I'll explain my question for people who don't know what I'm talking about. So antitrust law is the law that governs monopolies and trusts. And the idea is that you don't want to have a single entity that has vertical control over all aspects of production. And corporations law is just the general law that governs how business organizations operate, what their obligations are, how they're structured. And a common issue between the two is the alter ego problem. So how do you deal with alter ego, either with respect to these related party transactions independently, or to the fact that some of these persons are sitting on multiple boards and operating in some idea in the best interest of both, in the best interest of neither, in their own unique interests, or are subverting the interests of one organization for the other?
Right. Now, it's been 20 years since I've done my corporate law courses, so I just want to be sure that alter ego meaning that they're serving in multiple boards in possible conflict with one another?
So
or
alter ego is the idea that a subsidiary is, that one presumably independent corporation is truly a subsidiary of another.
Right. Yes, that is the issue. I think that what has to happen up front, I think, is that there has to be a ban really on that you cannot be on multiple boards. I think that is actually, and in fact, that's actually the step that a number of, about 9, I think there are 9 charter school states have rules that try to ensure that the boards are independent of the EMO. And so one of those would be requiring that they not serve multiple purposes. And so the problem has been, and there's actually such a rule in England, the problem has been enforcement. Is that this happens and there's no real sort of follow-up to look to make sure that there isn't this sort of dual role that gets played. So I think that in addition to having the rules, you have to have the will to enforce them and the capacity to enforce them. So I think that, so you need to have both of those occur. The problem that we see in these sectors is that even when we have those rules, we don't have the capacity. So, it's not enough really just to have those rules in place. You need to be willing to enforce them.
So maybe this will end up being more like a comment, we'll see how it comes out. But on this capacity point that you just raised, I'm just noticing that, so in Tennessee, charter authorizers are local school boards by and large.
Right.
And so they don't have any more sophistication on average than the people that are being named to the boards of the EMOs, the CMOs that are running the entities that you're talking about.
Right.
So the solution, it seems to me, can't be, rely on the authorizers, and the authorizers are just, 7, well-meaning citizens that have been assigned to have oversight. So I get it. You need to have the rules, but if you need to have the capacity, then it seems, at least in the Tennessee context, that would not be sufficient.
Right, and I totally agree with the question/comment. that in papers past, I think I did give the school boards way too much credit. And when I started thinking about this issue, I think that the capacity issue also plays out for school boards. That, you know, in the chartering context, I think that, you know, you need to have that capacity for the charter authorizer, be it school board, be it or non-school board or university entity, where you have people who have that sophistication. And if you don't have that sophistication, they should be working very closely with a law firm, you know, I love that, law firm or attorney who again is also you know, not beholden to the EMO. So they either need to have that skill set in these charter authorizers, and they also need to make sure that that skill set is also independent.
I'm sure there's something you developed for the paper, but I'm just wondering, like, so you mentioned that this type of problem exists in many industries where you have a private entity providing public services. So, like, are your solutions, are those driven by examples in other areas where this has worked? Are there good places that we can look for solutions to this problem? Or is this just something that everyone tries to have more oversight, but it just never works?
I mean, that's actually some steps I'm taking in right now. And in fact, you just identified a paper project that I'm working on right this very second, which is really to try to figure out kind of what that oversight would be. You know, how that oversight actually plays out in other contexts, be it the Food and Drug Administration, be it transportation, and then looking like how that works in those other sectors, and then thinking how that would look like in the case of education contexts like charter schools. So I'm working on that right now. I think that at the moment in my nascent in my sort of like inchoate thinking about this, I think that one thing we need to think about up front is kind of like analysis upon the entry into charters, like actually looking at the charter proposal, looking at how sound they are, looking at the chances for success, and like really, you know, looking at that much more carefully in ways very similar to what we see in medicine, I think, in terms of like testing out drugs. I haven't really thought completely about that, but I'm thinking in those terms where we actually have some sort of screening issue up front and then sort of like testing throughout. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's something that I'm truly thinking about, and it's a paper that, you know, I'm hoping it will come out in another year or two where I actually can come back and say, here's my answer.
I'm just sort of thinking about, like, I don't have any expertise on this, so your solutions seem reasonable, but I'm just wondering where they came from. Are they based on some sort of legal framework that you're drawing on? Are they based on evidence from other sectors
Right.
or other examples? Like, what would be, to the skeptical person, why should we believe that your
Right.
solutions?
The methodology that I've used, I didn't put up a methodology screen, but the methodology that I used actually is legal methodology called comparative. It's a comparative law framework, and the concept is called functionalism, and that is where you look at a particular problem. You look at a particular problem, compare it between international contexts, and then you ask, how do these entities solve these problems? And can one entity, you know, given the similarities that have occurred, can one entity learn from the other? And so what happens is, so the ideas that I talked about actually are ideas that many of them have been developed either in some state, you know, maybe a few states that have addressed this problem, or have been talked about in the case of England by the House of in Parliament. So these are actual discussions that have been going on either in a state or actually in legislation in England. I'm saying, okay, taking the ideas that have been developed, you know, in this context, this is a good idea to adopt in another context. So take the idea about focusing in on a particular having the charter authorizer actually focus on identify a particular type of contract and then approve that contract. That idea has actually been developed from legislation in California and in Connecticut, and also the recent legislation in England, or regulatory aspects in England. And so we look at this and then we kind of analyze, reading the literature in the field that's looked at this problem and saying, okay, well, this looks like a way to address that problem. So there is kind of like a literature review that goes on looking not only at the problem, but also at solutions in the state context and also in the national context to come up with the one best system. So that's kind of like, I don't know if that's the kind of methodology that we used in analyzing this.
So, again, I'm largely ignorant of the law, except for the ones that govern my daily existence, but thinking of like charters, sometimes argue one as a place of innovation, but alternatively as a market-based solution to reducing inefficiency elsewhere in the public sector. And it strikes me that taking a market-based approach then is going to create potential for market-related failures that we know exist elsewhere.
Right.
And it seems to me that some of this, right, could be framed also as kind of classical market failure,
right,
and like nepotism, cronyism, and a lack of fiscal responsibility. And it strikes me that state agencies, part of the reason that they get so bureaucratic and have been criticized as needing market-based reforms is that they've taken these things to their logical extreme in the other direction, right, where you have to have 3 bids, and they have to, be devoid of any sort of conflict of interest, and you always have to take the lowest of the bids. But that there'd be some room for like a middle ground, or like you're saying, random audits, or potential like flagging of problematic transactions that get automatically reviewed.
Right. Yeah. What we've been trying to do in our research is try to find a way that you can have this oversight without there being too much oversight. I joke that I'm a professor. I don't like being told what to do, and so I have to say that I've come around to this thinking grudgingly, that there is a need to provide oversight. But you're right, though, the danger, if you look at various educational reform initiatives, I would bet that what you see over the years is increasing regulation. My colleague Julie Mead, the University of Wisconsin, has done an analysis of the Milwaukee Public School Choice Plan. And she compares like the laws in the first year versus what's been happening after 20 years. And you'd be surprised at how much more extensive the rules have come. And what she has found is that they've come after, they've always come after some sort of scandal. They always come after some sort of scandal. So you will see these instances where something happens that we have to put rules in the books. I do agree that there could be that danger where it becomes, too much. So you always have to. So that my take on this is that you have to go slowly. You have to see a problem, and then once you see it more and more, then you say, okay, this is a thing, this is an issue, and so now we have to, create solutions for that. And you don't want to overreact, or something happens, and then you come up with a system that is really overreactive to a problem that's really a one-off.
It strikes me that charters having a reauthorization process, they already have some mechanism built in by which they could be.
Right. I think that.
Right.
Yeah, I think that what I'm saying is that a tweak that needs to occur, though, is this kind of like these these like related party transactions. They have to be a part of that now, I think. So that's kind of like one of these sorts of tweaks that we need to have going forward.
So, Preston, Michael. Sean's comment touched on some of the things I was going to ask about, but I have been trying to think through a question about the fact that one of the pitches for these organizations is that they can increase efficiency through economies of scale.
Right.
Yet it sounds like the concern is also that they're potentially wasting money by spending it in inefficient ways. So how do you grapple with those competing impulses? And how do the organizations, or to what extent do organizations have centralized processes that might naturally guide them towards competitive bidding at some point?
Right. Well, I think that the monitoring system that I talked about very briefly is the system that is set up to try to guard against possible abuses. You know, and the idea is that they understand that that there is this benefit, but the monitoring system is in place to say, for those persons who may abuse these transactions, these are the checks that are in place. So they're there. You know, they're there. I think that there is an attempt to try to address the problem. I think that we're getting more and more evidence that a little more needs to be done. And so what our attempt has been is to identify what those steps might be. So I don't know if I answered your question, but but I will tell you, the approach that I'm taking is something really that the head auditor of the National Auditing Organization in England, Sir Anais Morse, has been pushing for. And he has said that what needs to happen in these monitoring systems is that when you have a problem, you address that problem. But you really have to be sure not to over-address it. You know, so that's kind of the thinking that I've been trying to adopt in analyzing these things, is like, what is the step to take, you know, to address that problem without, you know, maybe tamping down on innovation.
So as I was listening to this, I was trying to think, you know, if I were Nina Reese or one of the state charter charter resource officials who's in charge of some of the authorization processes, I might hear this and say, you know, I agree that, you know, that financial monitoring is important for our charter schools, and then I would point to the number of charter schools that have been shut down for financial reasons, you know, in addition to those
Right.
that are shut down for academic reasons. Now, I wonder if you think that some of those measures are already enough. Let me tack on another question. So to the extent that we think that there is some type of skimming or you know people taking unnecessarily large profits off the top, don't we have to couple this with academic outcomes or some other outcome to say, yes, they're taking a larger profit margin here, but it also seems to come with better results and results that parents tend
Right.
to care for?
Yeah, I think I'll take the last question first and remind me about the
Yeah,
first
okay.
question after that. I think that and I will cite work of Bruce Baker and Gary Myron with respect to the last question, which is like kind of like looking at educational outcomes. I think that you have to think in terms of like who are the children that we're serving, right, when looking at educational outcomes. And what Baker and Myron have argued in their research is that one way that many of these charter schools will try to save money is to identify the students whom they wish to educate and then not educate those students whom they see are problematic. So, you know, so one example of this are students with disabilities. These are students who don't get, in many cases, don't get served in charter schools because they're seen as costing too much. And so I think that if we're going to look at outcomes, we have to also look in terms of the children whom they're serving and also to make sure that they're not engaging in egregious screening out. So, you know, so I'm saying that, so I'm willing to go along with that as long as one can show that, you know, that there is no, that all children are being served.
So my first question, agree with you there. My first question was, for a charter school official who would say, we're already, shutting down schools because of financial malpractice, fiscal distress, and in fact, that's probably the majority of charter schools that are already shut down. Do we need these?
I think that you may need them because then they may be less likely to shut down. I think this is it. I think I have come to have problems with the idea that success depends on the schools you shut down. Like we're saying, well, we're really successful. We shut down all these schools. When you shut down all these schools, you have kids who then are, who are kind of dispossessed and have to find other schools. So I'm not a big fan of using shutdowns as the proof of success. To me, that's like, I have analogized charter schools to, subprime mortgages, as I mentioned in lunch. That's kind of like saying success is that those persons who cannot actually pay a mortgage then get foreclosed on. So I have real problems with that. I would like to see the step taken where we ensure that these schools are successful up front. And so having, financial mechanisms in place, safeguards up front to make sure that they work, as I would say in the subprime context, proper screening up front, I would say would be the way to go.
Okay.
So I have to confess to always being a skeptic of solutions that have monitoring as a key component, especially when you're monitoring transactions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a couple of your solutions that you had identify risky either transactions or contracts, and there are probably hundreds of thousands of transactions and hundreds of contracts involved in most of these. So the criteria for identification of potentially risky contracts, and then the criteria that an auditor can use in the process of looking through maybe of that 100,000 transactions, they might look at 500 of those, and then can crisply identify the criteria for risk, seems to me to be a monumental task. I worked for several years for an agency governed by the Yellow Book standards and tried to set sampling methodology and criteria such as this for these. That's why I became less of a fan of monitoring. So it also seems to me that just to come back and maybe take this to a larger issue, if they're educating kids well and they're doing it within a reasonable budget and their kids are succeeding and they're not skimming, cream skimming, I don't really care. I want you to motivate me to care about related party transactions.
Sure.
Because I really want to care about the kids. And that's where I want to monitor that. I want to monitor.
That's right. I'll give you one.
They screen out those kids. That's important.
I'll give you one. We'll take real estate, right? Now, you should, I write a lot about kind of like real estate transactions and where they're occurring. They're occurring in communities of color. There's this, we're seeing more and more there's been federal and state. I mentioned California. I used to talk about new market tax credits that used to be in place. All of these were designed to create, building in communities of color. So they're actually being located in those communities. Now, if you have a school that over a 20 or 30-year period is spending 40% of its funding on rent, that is money that is not going to the education of those kids. Baker and Green have written quite a bit about the the spending that is necessary to provide communities of color, especially black kids, the resources that they would need to get an equitable and adequate education under state constitutions, similar to what white students might get. And we have concluded that it may take more resources, all things being equal. So if you are having a system that is being designed to help these students, but then having a situation where most of the funding isn't going toward those, toward education, then that's a concern. And so I would say that, this is the reason, these are reasons why we need to pay a lot of attention to related party transactions, because many of these transactions are going to occur in communities of color who arguably don't have sufficient resources under the best of circumstances to meet the needs of their kids. So if you have, if you're having the spending that even takes more resources from those children, then that's an issue. So that's the argument that I always give, when people say that why should we care? It's because it's where this money is being targeted, and these are the kids who are going to be affected the most.
So before Marissa asks that question, I just want to jump in with maybe an addendum question to
Sure.
that. Aren't there also externalities with charter school openings usually being associated, or in some metro areas being associated with school closures, public school closures?
Yes.
So you're not just looking at a naive real estate transaction here. You're looking at a real estate transaction that's happening in response or in concert or soon after a public school has been closed.
Right.
So that's one. And the second externality would be if this is public money that's being divested from the public school system, that's then paying charter management organizations and the like, how that's actually affecting the education that students are going to receive.
Right.
So you have a variety of equity questions
Right.
that may have equal protection consequences.
Maybe not equal protection consequences because they're going to lose.
I don't think.
I understand. I agree with you, by the way. I agree with you. I think that I would say that, these are additional, school closures are definitely an additional issue. I don't talk about it as much in my research, but yeah, in many of these communities, you have school closures coupled with, charters entering in there. And in fact, Hartford, where I think that's been a struggle as well there, where you're seeing all of these schools that are closing at the same time. You have charters then with policies whereby they may not be serving those kids. So yeah, I focus on a particular area, but there are definitely other areas that also need to be addressed in consideration with the charter school issue. I would add that one area that I've talked about in other papers is this, is the issue of where you have charter schools with multiple authorizers, all focused in these communities of color. So we're seeing this in places like Detroit, where you have traditional schools and you have charter schools, and all these schools serving kids in these communities. And an area that I've been doing a lot of research on is kind of how much funding, how does this impact the funding on the overall system? How does it affect the ability of that system to meet the needs of of kids who are in charter schools or who are in traditional public schools? And so I think that we need to take more of a systems approach to entering into educational choice options. I'm blanking on the professor at the University of South Carolina who's written Derek Black has written a great article. If you're really curious to see how this plays out constitutionally, Derek Black has written a great article about state constitutions and school choice, which really lays out the constitutional concern for thinking about these systems of schools and how they should fit within these communities.
Yeah, so I had a question in terms of how you see monitoring playing out over time. So one thing that struck me is that the MATs, one of their rules was that they had a pre-approval process.
Right.
But I guess I'm also wondering, what do you do if something is revealed over time, or imagine you can't just go buy a new building, or
Right.
or something new, you go buy a new building, and then
I-
how do they kind of disentangle themselves from what they're in?
You mean the situation if they didn't catch something up front?
Yeah.
First of all, I have to back up and say that, when designing these systems, that there's really no way that you're going to catch everything. That has to be very clear. It just can't happen. And it doesn't happen in charter schools. It doesn't happen in traditional systems. You can't do it. You really can't do it. I see it, and so if that happens, then you need to have a system in place where you can catch it later. And so, I am on Twitter a lot, as I told you, and you'll always see instances where someone will say, this school failed, there was a charter scandal. There was a charter scandal, this school spent X $1,000 dollars. Someone caught it. This has caught. And so I think that, we design these systems understanding that people are still going to speed, they're still going to run red lights, they're still going to run stop signs, but you have something in place to try to keep it within reason.
I had a question which you already kind of addressed about why England and kind of what's the value in doing this kind of cross-cultural comparison, and did you find anything, particularly around the equity issues, that was a value in England that could be applied to the context of the United States?
Explain the equity issues before I...
You kind of addressed it, talking about kind of the value of this work in general and looking at the related party stuff as it applies to communities of color in kind of Connecticut and other areas, California, that you mentioned. Is there anything comparable you saw arising in what you studied in England or any literature around that?
I haven't really, not with respect to related party transactions. England is a little different from the U.S. because the related parties are, the MATs are so prevalent, so they're not just in communities of color, they're really everywhere. So, so this is just a more pervasive problem in England, not just merely affecting communities of color. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but with respect to this particular issue, it's just a different context because the scale is just much larger.
Yeah, so I think an advocate of charter schools might argue that one of the real benefits is that you can get innovative leaders with a lot of great experience to run charter organizations and do schools in new and exciting ways. And in order to get people to do that, you need to incentivize them to come run these schools in some ways. So I'm thinking of someone who leaves a high-paying job in Silicon Valley to come to run a school. They might think that they want to be incentivized, they want to be compensated in some way while running this school. And so you might imagine that some related party transactions that kind of incentivize them to stay and to run these organizations, you could at least make an argument, whether you agree with it or not, there might be some level that might be appropriate, but how can we think about what would be appropriate, at what point do we get to be not being faithful with dollars?
I think, there are two schools of thought. There are people who take the position that there can be no profit. I'm not in that camp. I think about it in terms of what would be the market value for it. So, so I would hope that being able to make money based on market value would be sufficient. I would push back on this and say that you are getting public money, to your private entity serving for the public good, and so there has to be some limit on the amount of profit you can make. For me, that limit is whatever the market, whatever the analysis of what would be appropriate would be. And beyond that, I would have a problem with that. So I don't know if that's answered your question. Someone in Silicon Valley is making a whole lot of money, but one has to understand that, when providing these services, it's a public service, and I would argue a constitutional service. So, the money that you're going to be making has to take that constitutional level into consideration.
last question.
I'm kind of building off what Walt said and also going back to Gary's point. It just seems like Gary's argument about, well, if these schools are performing better on outcomes that we care about, why is this important? And your response was, well, they're concentrated in communities of color. We might be very worried about the abuses there, and we might think that the resources required to provide an adequate education to these students is higher. And I agree with that. But isn't that not the argument that is being made? It's more about like the comparison is to the schools that they would have gone to otherwise. And so yes, we would like to increase the resources to these students in general. Like I totally am on board with that. But the comparison is not to some benchmark that we're not providing. It's to what the school they would have gone to is. And so why is it not the case that we should judge them on how well they are doing compared to the school that they would have gone to and let the market figure this out?
Would that be an apples to apples comparison, first of all?
I mean, on the condition that they're not doing practices like selectively choosing students. I think we can agree that that's enough.
Right. If they're, yeah, I mean, if, you know, if you could get through all of that and then say that they are, you know, that they are doing well, I won't push back as hard. There will be others who would, but that would not be my pushback. I would argue, though, that I have to say I am somewhat skeptical about how that is actually playing out at the moment. You know.
Doesn't that make that the issue and not the related party transaction? Is how the students, how, you know, those types of things?
I don't see it that way because there are a couple of things. One is that, you know, there are a couple of things. One, you know, let me think about that.
Question related to your question?
Yeah, I'll think. Yeah, I'll think about that. I will think because I. What?
Like what amount of, like how would you know that the amount of money that like the charter school manager is making is market value? Like how does the market know if they don't know how much
Because
they're getting paid?
Another charter organization who can do it better is going to come along and say, I'm not going to pay you $120,000, I'm going to pay you $100,000. We can use that $20,000 to better educate students, and that leads to better outcomes. I mean, that's the argument.
Right. I think that this is a case where we'll have to see, really. We're going to have to see about this. Yes. Was there another hand up?
So I've seen lots of studies of cream skimming and excluding students. I've seen, and we've done some work here on charter schools and students with disabilities. I've seen none yet that support exclusion of those kids from, you know, a quantitative, good data, not anecdotal study that shows that those things have gone on. So I do think there are ways to check, and there are being checked about this. Now, the use of exclusionary discipline, I think, is an area that merits a lot more work. But in terms of skimming, I think that the data would suggest that now the effectiveness data is not clear cut, but the exclusionary data, I think, is, to my knowledge, is pretty sound on that issue.
Right. I think my response to all of your pushback on this is that we. What was that?
There might be an intervening point here.
Okay.
I'll let you answer because
No, go on. No, you go for it.
I would just go on record as saying that higher test scores among in grades 3 through 8 on math and reading is not a sufficient justification for corrupt allocation of dollars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, my point is, we care about other values, right? So, I mean, there are funds that could be spent in a different way, and
Right.
There are other justifications, I think, for caring about stuff.
Well, you said it before I did. Right. You know, you said it before I did. I think that I will say as well that, you know, that we're just slowly beginning to see academic research on this issue. You know, there's academic research on this issue. There's academic research finally talking about kind of like how money gets spent and the impact on student performance. We know that that research is out there. And we're finally starting to think about that with respect to charter schools. And so, you know, for those of you who are pushing back, I'd say, you know what? Look into it. This is an area that needs to be studied. And this is an area that we need to think about because, you know, if I'm right, this could have a major negative impact on the success of these systems. So prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Do the research, and we'll talk in a few years.
And with my apologies, Joe.
That's okay. This is a big question, so it might not be just 2 minutes, but I thought, just stepping back from the paper, I'm sort of interested in your general research agenda about thinking about when we have the private sector providing public services, what are the issues that come up, right? And we've had an interesting talk on one issue, and I'm just wondering if maybe you could say a few words about things to think about, kind of issues, from your work on charter schools and other
Right.
things that we should kind of think about.
I think that, I should say that stepping back, the global aspect of my research has been looking at this sort of public-private conundrum in charter schools, and then looking at how it plays out in other contexts, and how it may play out in education. So that's kind of like how I've been looking at this issue. And so I think that as I go forward with this, I think what we have to think about really is kind of like how these systems, like for all of you researchers out there who are looking at this, you want to think about like how these systems are similar to traditional systems and then private systems, and then like how to measure success. This is the discussion that we've been having about this. And then given this, how do you come up with a sweet spot whereby you come up with the regulations that, that does reasonable guarding against possible abuse while at the same time encouraging innovation. So I think that as you go forward with this, these are like the 3 major questions that I see, but I'm going to add a 4th. And the 4th one that I think that you need to be thinking about too, especially in the United States, is kind of like how these issues will play out in terms of equity, and especially communities of color. I do see that a lot of these ideas are percolating and focusing in these communities. And these communities may have different stresses, different concerns, and may not have the resources that other communities may have. So, so the things that we're talking about, which may generally not have an impact, may have a negative impact on these communities especially. So I think that, as we go forward, these are the major questions to be thinking about. And, as far as choice goes, as far as charters and privatization goes, the horse has left the barn, the train has left the station, we're doing this. We're not calling that back. So I think that the focus has to be, how do we make this stuff work? And so that's kind of like my charge to you. And I thank you so much for having me here to talk.
Y'all, please join me.